Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today I'm here with Dr. Matthew J. Thomas. I'll call you Matthew here on out if that's okay.
Yeah, go
So
for it.
I was about to say Dr. Thomas. Okay, Matthew. How are you doing today?
Um, I'm doing great. I'm doing great. We're a little exhausted. We've had our fourth kids. We got four kids under 7 in a pretty small house, and they tend to break into here as well.
Yeah.
So it's if you see the door opening and lots of screaming and shouting, it's not terrorists.
Yeah.
It's the children who want to be on the podcast, but we've informed them what's going on, so hopefully
Yeah.
they'll let us do this for a little while.
It'd be kind of funny if like the door opens, and then your wife comes in and like drags the kid out, like in that one video. I forget. I think it was the BBC or something like that. Do you remember that?
Yeah. Oh
Yeah.
no, I've seen that, and that's every day of my life. I'm teaching a summer Greek class currently, and it's gotten to the point where baby Mike, who we got to stop calling him baby soon because he's 1.5, but I end up having to teach with him on my lap actually for about sometimes like half the class. I'll have him on my lap for an hour because he wants to be in here, and that's often the best way to do it. So who knows, we'll see. Maybe we'll even get a baby Mike cameo at some point.
Yeah, baby Mike cameo. That'd be great.
Yep.
And so Dr. Thomas, I'm just gonna call you Dr. Thomas. Dr. Thomas, have you been working on a new book or any recent publications? What's been going on in your academic life?
Yeah, so the main academic stuff that I've been doing, we've been really fortunate that the reprint of the works of the law book with InterVarsity has just gotten the interest that it has, and seems the material in there seems to be just of interest and helpful to folks the same way I think that is of interest to me. So that's been occupying a lot of time and energy has been going, and just continuing to do stuff in relation to that. So other podcasts and other different writings kind of relate to that. So different requests, which again, I'm really grateful for, because setting the early reception of Paul for me is something that I've found has enriched my own reading of scripture so much, and so it's great to be able to share that with other folks as well. So that's been something that's continued to go on a bunch over the past past number of months. And then the project that I've been focusing on is the book on Clement of Rome for the Saint Vladimir's Popular Patristic series. So it's been a couple of years now that we've been working on this. So, which is a new translation introduction. Looking specifically at some of the questions around the dating. So there's the Thomas Heron's thesis, wants to date it in 6970. And so I've spent a lot of time looking at the both the internal and external evidence for that, and trying to weigh all of that. So
yeah, what conclusion do you come to, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, gosh, this is a really dangerous game that you're playing, going opening me up to a question like this.
Or what we could do is I could pause the recording, you tell me, and then I'll just record my response.
I love it. No, let's go for it. So it's interesting. The way when I first agreed to go into work on this book, Clement has been a major interest of mine for a long time. I just have a huge appreciation, both for first and second Clement. And the way that I would have construed, the way I would have described the evidence previously would have been to say that the internal evidence of First Clement supports the earlier dating of 6970, and that the external evidence supports the later date of around 95. And I've been going through over the past couple of years and basically taking every piece of external evidence that I can find related to Clement and related to the stories, as far as when was he around, what was he doing, what was his relationship to Peter, what was his succession like between Peter and Clement. And I've tabulated all of these on a very large Excel sheet, and then and weighed them to say which way it goes. And looking at all of it, I actually think that I was mistaken. I actually think that the external evidence favors the earlier dating as well.
Wow.
And which for me is striking because again, it goes against what I thought initially going in and looking at this question. So anyway, I'm hoping to finish that project this year and get it out, because it is stuff that I've been working on for a long time, and I'd love to be able to share it with folks. And it's just also just really edifying working. If anyone's had a chance to spend time in the first or second Clement, they don't make it into manuscripts of the New Testament for no reason. It's because they're just really good. They're really, really edifying texts, and so it's a joy, and it's an honor to be able to spend time with them.
Yeah, well, when you get that book published, or maybe closer to when it's published, I have tons of questions for you on Clement, but
Oh
I
yeah,
don't want to
absolutely,
detract from our saint,
absolutely, yeah,
the man that we're studying today.
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, so the guy that we're studying today, obviously, is Saint Irenaeus, or Irenaeus of Lyons, and I want to ask you, or at least something that I noted in your book. I noticed that you had, I think it was A, B, and C sources in the reprint for IVP Academic. So Paul's Works of the Law and Perspective of Second Century Reception. I didn't pick up the more Seebeck edition
Yeah,
of the book.
yeah, yeah.
But yeah,
It's probably wise, because you probably wouldn't be in a house right now. You'd be living in a box, I think. So,
although I did buy, I bought Marcus Bachmuel's The Remembered Peter off of More
okay.
Seebeck, and that cost me a pretty penny. So
Yeah, well, the other one, Simon Peter, Inscription and Memory,
that's a good one. Yeah. Mhm.
the one with Baker. Not only is it more affordable, it's also just tremendous. It's a book that I recommend to everybody. It's a really Marcus. I've said this a number of times. I think that Marcus Bachmuel is the most underrated scholar in biblical scholarship that's
Mhm.
around. I think he's kind of like your favorite New Testament scholar's favorite New Testament scholar. He's just incredible with what he does.
Yeah. Well, I remembered in your book that you published, with IVP Academic, you mentioned that Irenaeus is probably one of the best sources in terms of, because you limit yourself to sources within living memory of the apostles. And then the other thing that you do is that you try to assess to what extent do they actually address or interpret Paul's works of the law and get us a very kind of clear, or at least nice exposition into what Paul meant. And so Irenaeus, I think he got your A rating, if I'm not mistaken, if that's how the
Yeah,
system was working. And
that's
so
great.
I want to ask you, so who was Saint Irenaeus of Lyons, and what was his relationship to Polycarp? What's his relationship to the living memory of the apostles?
Yeah, so Irenaeus was born actually it seems to be in the eastern part of the empire, because we know that he was around Smyrna, where Polycarp was, and sometime between 130 and 140 AD, and lived on the eastern side of the empire, grew up around there. And then we don't know a great deal about sort of the middle part of his life, but we know that towards the latter half of the second century, we find him in the on the western part of the empire, over in Lyon, and that he was over there, and was someone who was helping with the church over there, which in the midst of the persecutions that are going on, which I think it's in book 5 of Eusebius's history is where you go and come across that. So just the incredible stories of the martyrs of Lyon. So you have the bishop over there, Pothinus, who was martyred, and then Irenaeus is the one who goes and takes over and is ordained as the bishop after him, which is really quite incredible to think about. In that you have somebody who is martyred as the leader of the church, along with kind of everyone who's of any sort of prominence within the church. And then the question is, well, who would like to take over next? Like who would like to be the next man up? And this is Irenaeus. And so he's the dates that we have for his literary career, around 180 AD, in the years around then, is one of most of his dates. There's Against Heresies, the major work is in 5 books, and then we have his demonstration of the apostolic preaching as well, which is a synthesis of a lot of the major themes that you get in Against Heresies, but in a short form. He's thought to have been martyred sometime in the early 3rd century, maybe around 202 AD, but we don't have as solid an account of his martyrdom as we do for some other figures like Polycarp. The way that this is just the way I think of it personally. And so if this doesn't help, by all means, don't hang on to it. But as an analogy for the relationship between Irenaeus and Polycarp, and why that success, is significant, and why it makes it so that interpretation in this period is, I think, particularly valuable as a historical resource. Irenaeus is not interpreting in a way that is strictly based off of the text. So if you think of, you and I, when we open a biblical text, we pick it up, we're looking at it, and we think, oh yeah, this is cool, we like this, and then we got a question over here, we think, oh, maybe we'll open a commentary, and maybe Josephus says something about this where we have some kind of context, or maybe Suetonius has something to say about what's happening over here. But we're limited in our access to this period to written text. There's nothing else that's around, and so we don't have any other advantages, anything else we can appeal to. And when we say even written text, 20 centuries later, just what happens to have survived, just from the process of kind of history passing. What's great about this early period is that you're not just dealing with texts themselves, you're dealing with texts, but also the historical memory and the historical interpretation of the persons and the places involved. And the analogy that I always think of personally, because it means so much to me, C.S. Lewis has always been my hero. And for me, something that was left a really big impression on me was getting to know Walter Hooper, who was his literary trustee, and who came in at the end of Lewis's life, and was somebody who was really trusted to him, and was living over the kilns and everything. And when Lewis died, he became sort of this person who preserved the memory of Lewis, really for the whole following generation, and he devoted his whole life to it. And so there's all kinds of people who know details about Lewis, from small funny things like he used to go skinny dipping in the lake behind the kilns and stuff like that. You can go see the lake, and we've been over there, we've seen the lake over there. There's all kinds of details that are not strictly limited to the texts themselves, that someone like like myself and other people who have known Walter well, we have access to when we're reading Lewis, when we're interpreting Lewis. And so it's not just the words on the page, but we actually are familiar with the historical context. And so if you think of Polycarp was a disciple of John. So if you think of this isn't, I'm not by saying this, I'm not putting Lewis on the level of St. John. But if you were to go and do that, if you have Lewis as John and Walter Hooper as Polycarp as the link, then you have people in my position who learned from Walter Hooper, who got to know him, as being in the position of Irenaeus, where we're not just reading Lewis, just pick up Paralandra, pick up whatever.
Well,
whatever happens to
Dr.
be.
Thomas, you can say that you're Irenaeus if you want to in this example.
Yeah, this is I feel like we're already off on a really sacrilegious kind of stuff, where the overestimation that's here is pretty remarkable. But anyway, just for to make the analogy work, I think that's part of the way that I think, the same way that for myself to go into interpret Lewis, I'm able to do so in a way that is informed by more than just, hey, I just read this thing a lot, but I know because of living memory, because of the way that memory has been preserved over the past years since Lewis lived and since he died. I'm able to have a more informed way of understanding what's going on. And if there's something that's a question, as far as like, hey, does he mean this, does he mean this over here, I'm in a position to engage with that that's a lot better than it would be otherwise. And so I think that's why interpreters like Irenaeus are so valuable. And Yeah, and Marcus Bachmann is his book here, Seeing the Word, which is a really fantastic book. He talks about there being a stage of a couple of generations like this, and this period of living memory that goes up to Irenaeus. So again, around 180 AD to towards the end of the 2nd century, where interpretation is informed directly by this what's remembered, by the historical context that was there. And how it's interesting how you don't find the same kinds of appeal to personal memory getting into the 3rd century. You just don't have that in the same kind of way. And so when we're thinking about a fully historical interpretation of what it was that Christ and the apostles and their successors were talking about, something like Irenaeus is really, really helpful, because there again, it's not just he's a holy guy who picked up the Bible and we're going to listen to him and just say whatever he said is right, which isn't to say any of those things aren't true, but there is a privileged historical position that's there that I think if we are trying to be fully historical in our engagement with the New Testament, then we do well to take into account its early reception.
Yeah, and maybe for the audience too, could you go into just the meaning? And I know you already talked about the significance of living memory, but could you kind of touch on both the meaning of living memory and its significance?
Yeah, so living memory is a term that I get from Marcus Bachmann, from the Seeing the Word, and it's precisely just what I was saying, that what you're dealing with is memories of people who you were actually in contact with. And so there's different people will go and estimate differently how long memories can go and last. And so the way that a story preserved by somebody's grandmother can go and be told to the next generation, to the kids that are there, and how long a story that's like that can be preserved in a way that keeps all of the details basically in line, so that it doesn't go and turn into something else. So certain scholars of memory will go and estimate differently, as far as saying, does that carry on for 100 years? Does it carry on for 150 years? Does it carry on for 200 years? And you can find all kinds of interesting cases. Craig Keener is a guy who has a lot of really interesting stuff in this area as well. If you look at his Biography, the way that stories can be preserved and memories can be preserved authentically over decades and even centuries. That's the idea that this is getting at. And so that I am a living representative and I'm a living holder of those memories that go back to the original events, that themselves. So it's not a strictly kind of textual relationship, in that I'm not just sort of picking this up the way that you or I might, pick up biblical text and then just sort of guessing what the historical context might be. This is actually part of my own memory bank and worldview as it's been passed on from those who knew those original people.
Yeah, I remember, in Craig Keener's book on, Biography, he does say somewhere that, like, when you still have living memory, scholars don't even call it oral tradition at that point; they call it oral history or
Yeah,
something like that, because of just how close it is.
yeah,
And I think he also gave an estimate that, was it oral history or living memory can last up to 80 to 150 years or something like that. And so that puts
yeah,
Irenaeus well within the ballpark, including,
yeah,
Polycarp and the rest.
yeah. No, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right.
Well, let's move on to the third question I have here, which is actually, so I mean, you mentioned the various works that Irenaeus did, but one of the ones that he's most known for is Against Heresies. And so I'm interested in you kind of explaining to us, what is Against Heresies about, and what is its context? What moved Irenaeus to write this? Was there an actual heretic or group of heresies that he was trying to fight? What's going on here?
Yeah. So the subheading of Against Heresies is against the knowledge falsely so called.
Mm,
And that word knowledge is pointing to gnosis.
right.
It's the Gnostics who are the target of what he's doing. And so in the 2nd century, you have all of these various Gnostic groups who are going around and taking pieces of the apostolic deposit, but then going and placing them within their own interpretive frameworks and laying claim to them into the sort of secret knowledge that's associated with it, so that you can go and you can have the real the real gospel, and they tend to go into name the movements after themselves as well. So you have the Valentinians, for example, named after Valentinus, and you can kind of go down the list. What Irenaeus goes and likens them to doing is he has this well-known image of the way that it's like as if you have a mosaic, which it represents a king, and they take the pieces of the mosaic and they rearrange all of them to go into to make them like a fox instead. And they change everything around and take the things out of the sequence that is the true historical sequence, in order to go and to make those individual pieces into something else. The analogy and again, if this isn't helpful for anyone, by all means, go and get rid of it. What you see the Gnostics doing, the Gnostic move, is to take elements of the Christian tradition, and specifically around Christ himself, and to place them within a different narrative framework, within that a different narrative framework than that of the Old Testament scriptures. So they take Christ as a character. Sometimes they'll take the apostles as characters, but they're plugging them into what is just a completely different narrative. And the analogy, this was suggested to me by my friend Ryan ages ago, and it's always stuck with me as the best way to say what the Gnostics are doing. Have you ever seen the movie Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter?
Oh yeah.
Okay. So I never had a chance to see the movie, which is really a shame, because it seems like it's the perfect analogy, where you're taking Abraham Lincoln, who's recognizable as historical character. He's important. He's clearly the protagonist, etc. Except he's not, kind of the whole Civil War thing. You're not really worried about that narrative. There's a different narrative that's going on here. It's vampires, and we've got to go and kill the vampires. And it's Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. It ends up sort of being the equivalent of Jesus Christ Vampire Hunter. You're taking Christ and you're putting him in all of these totally different narratives, different systems, and then going and saying, this is the true secret knowledge. This is the real story about Christ. It's not that, that lame, Jewish stuff. Most of these Gnostics tend to not be, interested in being associated with, the Jewish heritage of Christ in any way. It's not any of that. Instead, it's this over here. So, there's a sense in which there's a really interesting compliment that's paid to Christ through going and doing this. The same way there's kind of an interesting compliment that's paid to Abraham Lincoln, and going, there's a recognition of there's something extraordinary, about this, this person that we're making up all of these new, stories and systems and everything. But what it actually ends up doing in practice, the same way that it would not be salutary to go and to throw out all the historical information that we have about Abraham Lincoln and just go with Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter and say, here's the real thing. Even more so when we're talking about the salvation of humanity, doing that with our Lord and Savior doesn't really end up producing a whole lot of good in the end. And so that's what Irenaeus is reacting against heresies, is all these various systems of the Gnostics. What's really interesting, a couple of things. If you're saying, if you ask Irenaeus, why is it that you bother going through to catalog all of this, what's the point of writing? Is it are you trying to prove all these people wrong, etc. Irenaeus is consistent in testifying the reason that he does this. One, there's an element of you're to protect the sheep, and as a bishop, he has a job to go and to protect the sheep, to make sure that they don't go and fall into error. But it's remarkable how often Irenaeus testifies that the reason that he does what he does is out of love for the Gnostics themselves. there's a phrase that he uses where he says that he's talking about what he's doing is like, we seem to love them better than they love themselves. And that's and going, and if there is a strong negative element to his project, he likens it to a doctor who's going and taking what is very strong medicine to go and to counteract something that's negative, that's going to bring about the death of the patient. You don't go and you don't prescribe just in accordance with the patient's whims, but you prescribe in accordance with truth, what's actually going to go and to bring them to health and to life. And so that's one of the things that's really striking. And I think that, we can all stand to learn from in writing against these people who are, his theological enemies, and who he's seen people go and fall into these kinds of errors and, really suffer as a result. It's not strictly, a title like Against Heresies, you could think of it as being, largely a negative project, which is, just going and slandering all those people, et cetera.
Mhm.
And, he doesn't pull punches as far as what's wrong about their beliefs, but he also is consistent in saying the reason that we're doing is so that God might somehow bring them back to redemption, and that he can bring them back, to the true fold of Christ. And so that's one thing that's striking about his work. The other that really jumps out, if you go through the five books of Against Heresies, which, by the way, if you only remember one thing, anyone listening, please read through the 5 books of Against Heresies. They're life-changingly good, and there's no way that I could possibly summarize or do justice to them. It takes work to go through it, but it's hard for me to identify something outside of Scripture itself that repays that work more than reading these 5 books. They're just absolutely incredible. What's interesting with these 5 books is the first 2 books are mostly devoted to describing the various heresies. So saying, here's what this group believes, here's what this group believes, here's what this group believes. And from Irenaeus' standpoint, this is so important because it says the reason that nobody's been able to go and to actually advance against these heresies and help to expose them for what they are is because they keep all their doctrines secret. They keep what they believe secret. And so nobody actually knows what it is. So you can't argue against, something if they're not actually telling you what what their view is. And so that's why it's so the descriptive part of what Irenaeus is doing is so important. And it's interesting with some of the the manuscript stuff that we've had come up in Oxyrhynchus, for example. We've seen from some of these Gnostic groups the descriptions of their own beliefs, which you can see Irenaeus was quite good at going describing what these people went and and said and did, and then 18 centuries later we get in Egyptian desert we get these kinds of confirmation for it. So
he was accurate in the way he presented his opponents.
He was, yeah, which again is there's something that is I think is really laudable that's there. And it's not just from a standpoint, it's not just the extension of charity to his opponents. It's essential if you're actually going to effectively argue against them to be able to know exactly what they believe and why they believe it, insofar as there is some kind of rhyme or reason behind it. When you're dealing with something that's Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter kind of quality, you might not be able to get a whole lot of rhyme or reason there. But insofar as there's something that's possible, he tries to go into to do that. What's interesting is that most of Against Heresies is not actually against heresies. Most of Against Heresies, books 3, 4, and 5, are actually the positive exposition of the Christian faith as it was known and believed and understood within the late 100s AD. And for that, it's as a historical witness to Christianity, it's invaluable. There's nothing like it. There's nothing that's on the same scope or level. And I think regardless where one's denominational identity happens to lie, all of us go back to the Christians of this era. Even those of us who are least interested in the early church, we only know about Christianity because of people like Irenaeus and the way that they went and they preserved the scriptures and preserved the faith for us, often at the risk of their own lives in the face of really violent persecution. And so it's particularly those three books, books three, 4, and 5. There's a genealogical tie that all of us have to, going back to Christ and the apostles, where it's pretty hard to find anybody who's a Christian where that lineage doesn't go through Irenaeus in some form or fashion as well. And so I think because of that, it's so important to take him seriously. And it's not just important like, hey, we have to. It's an absolute joy. There's just so many treasures that you find in reading him.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm interested then, like for someone who, might be interested in reading Irenaeus, maybe even for his apologetic value to the Christian faith.
Yeah.
What kinds of things does he say about, for instance, the nature of Jesus Christ? What kinds of things does he say about, for instance, I remember when Michael Licona was debating Bart Ehrman in one of their debate series. I think was it Licona brought up that Irenaeus is the one who identifies John the Apostle as the author of John, the Gospel of John, right? And then Bart Ehrman was like, that's too late, or that's not good enough, or whatever, But what's the apologetic value of Irenaeus? What kinds of things does he say?
Yeah. So one of the things that's so interesting about reading Irenaeus is how ideas that are often associated with later centuries. So 4th century debates, for instance, on the nature of Christ, the divinity of Christ, etc. So you think to Athanasius arguing against Arius in the back and forth. That's there. One of the things that's really interesting in reading Irenaeus is you see how all of these things, it's not like they just suddenly show up in the 4th century. These are common Christian orthodoxy, in the late 100s. And they're the kinds of things that are accepted by everyone. This is what all of the churches everywhere believe. And so, one example is, there's the statement on the incarnation, which goes back to Saint Athanasius, that to the effect of the Son of God became man, so that man might become sons of God. So which so the idea of deification, that I heard it said before that, oh well, this is some later kind of 4th century invention, etc. These aren't. This doesn't have to do with what Jesus and the apostles are actually doing. And what's fascinating is you go into Irenaeus and you see verbatim he goes and says the same things, which I thought I thought these kinds of statements weren't around for centuries. You're going to find similar things, ideas that you'll in your mind have attributed to St. Augustine, for example. Some of the things that he'll say about the fall and redemption, and you'll think, oh, that's it's an Augustinian way of looking at it. And then you'll read Irenaeus and you're like, nope, Irenaeus is saying this in 180 AD, and when he's saying this, he's not saying this as an independent thinker. This is one of the things that's striking and remarkable about Irenaeus, is that he's not trying to be anything more than a link in a chain. And when it comes to originality of thought, he's really clear that that's not what he's trying to do. The Gnostics are the ones who have they're all about originality of thought. The church is about faithfully preserving what it is that Christ and the apostles have given her, and preserving it unchanging. And so he uses the analogy of saying like the Christ and apostles are like, or Christ is like a rich man who's deposited a lot of money in a bank, and the church is like the bank, and like we guard this with our lives, the same way that a bank goes and guards its guards all its money, and preserves it as faithful as it can, because you recognize the value of it. So too, this is what the church does. And so that's one of the things that is so striking in reading Irenaeus, is ideas that are often associated with later periods, at least in our minds, with these later figures. You just see it all laid out there. There's a quote here which I love. This is from the beginning of book 1, from chapter 10, and he talks here about I guess you could say the Catholic, which is to say the universal nature of the Christian faith, and how, in contrast to the Gnostics, who everybody's going to their own opinions here and there, there is something that the churches all recognize, the Gnostics themselves all recognize as being the universal faith that's held by Christians where you happen to be. So I'll read this for you. It's a great passage. So, as I have already observed, the church, having received this preaching and this faith, although scattered throughout the whole world, yet as if occupying but one house, carefully preserves it. She also believes these points of doctrine just as if she had but one soul and one in the same heart, and she proclaims them and teaches them and hands them down with perfect harmony, as if she possessed only one mouth. For although the languages of the world are dissimilar, yet the import of the tradition is one and the same. For the churches which have been planted in Germany do not believe or hand down anything different, nor those in Spain, nor those in Gaul, nor those in the East, nor those in Egypt, nor those in Libya, nor those which have been established in the central regions of the world. But as the Son, that creature of God, is one and the same throughout the whole world, so also the preaching of the truth shineth everywhere, and enlightens all men that are willing to come to a knowledge of the truth. Nor will any one of the rulers in the churches, however gifted he may be in point of eloquence, teach doctrines different from these, for no one is greater than the master. Nor, on the other hand, will he who is deficient in power of expression inflict injury on the tradition. For the faith being ever one and the same, neither does one who is able at great length to discourse regarding it make any addition to it, nor does one who can say but little diminish it. A beautiful passage.
Yeah, that's wonderful, man. Wow.
Yeah, I just want to have an altar call right now. It's fantastic stuff.
Yeah, it's just beautiful.
It's fantastic.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, the whole imagery and everything is just incredible. So, well, I don't want to pop our bubble, but I do have a question about what Irenaeus got wrong. However, and so oftentimes, when people will cite Irenaeus as a reliable witness into the Christian faith, some people will say, but Irenaeus, he got the age of Jesus wrong, right? Because he thought Jesus was crucified as an older man and that sort of thing. I mean, and with respect to that particular error, what are your thoughts on that, Dr. Thomas? Why did he get that wrong?
Yeah, boy. So the first thing I'll say is that my enthusiasm for engaging with this particular passage is really low. Not because I don't think it's an interesting passage. It's because what I find is that this particular passage is so often used as an excuse to actually not read Irenaeus, or not take what he or the other fathers say seriously, which I think is really unfortunate. And it's it's interesting. I was thinking about this earlier, the way that this passage gets used analogously to the way that people don't want to take like the New Testament seriously, for instance. So you get somebody who is a kind of a more skeptical agnostic type or whatever, and they'll find something, they'll say, the New Testament is historically reliable because Josephus says that the census under Quirinius goes and takes place over here in this period, and then Luke goes and says it takes place over here, and Josephus was a historian, and therefore the Bible is historically unreliable. Therefore, I don't have to read it. Therefore, stop talking to me. Leave me alone to go live my life. That's kind of the disposition that I find that ends up getting used towards Irenaeus a lot of times with this particular passage. And what's ironic is it's often Christians themselves who are going and doing it, but just Christians who want to be left alone, who are like, no, I'm doing fine over here. I don't need anybody else. I'm just going to read the Bible myself, and I can say, I can interpret it, for on my own. So please, leave me alone, Mr. Irenaeus. Which as a disposition towards truth, I don't think is something that we really want to inculcate. I think when we recognize that disposition in ourselves, elsewhere, I think we recognize that this is not a particularly fruitful way to engage with anything. And so that's the first thing I would say is just what is an interesting passage otherwise. My enthusiasm is greatly tempered for it, just because Irenaeus says 1,000 interesting things, and to just take one of the 1,000 interesting things and to use it as an excuse to not look at the other 999, to me, is really unfortunate. So anyway, that's I guess prolegomena, but that's really how I feel about the passage. If you're looking at the passage itself, it's not one that I'm an expert in. There's people, you can find all kinds of articles on it. You can find all kinds of different people going and saying different things. You're going to have camps of people who are going and saying, yes, Irenaeus is, or sorry, people who are saying, no, Irenaeus is not saying this. He's not trying to say that Jesus, lived until he was, after basically 40. So up to 50. And for anyone who's unfamiliar with this, what Irenaeus is doing is he's commenting on John 8. And in John 8, where you have the Jews coming to him and saying, you're not 50 years old and you know Abraham. And what he goes and talks about is where does that come from? Why are they saying you're not 50 years old if he was only 30 years old? And there's theological reasons for what he's doing, because it has to do with his idea of recapitulation, how it is that Christ goes and recapitulates every part of humanity. And so that's part of why you have the incarnation, because he became as a young child to save young children, as an infant to save infants, as an adult to go and save adults. And it kind of goes on from there. So he talks about this passage and then how it must be that Jesus was older than simply 30 years old in order to basically meet a kind of charge like this, as he does from the Jews in John 8. There's certain interpreters will say, Irenaeus still isn't saying that he was 50 years old when he goes and does that. He's saying something else over here. There's other people who will go and say, no, he thinks Jesus was at least somewhere close to 50 when he died, however old you happen to think that is. And anyone who's interested in trying to adjudicate between those two sides, by all means, go and do so. You're going to find plenty that's written, on this from both sides. And from my standpoint, it's not something that I guess I would say that I have as a particular area of concern. One is because I think that if you're looking in any kind of figure, take any church father, any sort of the most venerable of church writers, there's this kind of sense that either you have to have somebody who is 100% sacrosanct and accurate in everything that they go and say, or else they're just out. They're totally gone. There's no you ignore them. You pretend like they're not there. And it seems to me that in playing that kind of game, that one is applying an epistemology that one applies nowhere else in any kind of other human interaction. And honestly, if you're gonna, even somebody like, say, for example, my buddy Spencer, he's a huge fan of John Piper, loves John Piper. He's got every John Piper book. He's read all of them. And he's a huge fan, loves them. And, he uses this stuff in his ministry all the time. Is he going to say that John Piper has every single thing right? No, he doesn't. He doesn't think that John Piper has every single thing right. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't think that he's an extremely helpful witness to what it is that Scripture is and teaches, and what it is that we're how it is we're meant to live the Christian life. And so somebody can go and point to some error in Piper's. And so if you do go the route and saying, no, I think that Irenaeus is wrong in this, to me, that doesn't mean that he's in a necessarily different, a different position than my friend, who literally, he loves Piper. He's got every book that he's there, and he still freely goes and says, yeah, I think, I don't think that he has everything 100% right, but that's okay, because there is so much that is there that is right, that when you have something that might be off, it does go and it stands out, and you can recognize it, for what it is. And I mean, you can apply this, to C.S. Lewis as well. You can say, gosh, he wrote Spirits in Bondage, and it's not very good. Or fill in the blank. The Pilgrim's Regress is a little hokey. There's that's the reality. But he still is C.S. Lewis. He still does what he does. And so the first thing I would say is that it seems as though what one is doing epistemologically there, the kind of standard that you're trying to hold Irenaeus to, it's just not consistent with how we work as human beings. And I think that the appeals to this passage can kind of just give away that what we're trying to do often is not to, understand the fathers and to appropriate and appreciate and learn what we can for them. We're looking for an excuse to not read them so that we can just go and do our own thing, which strikes me as somebody who, from a background not knowing this stuff, and has really had a chance to, to spend a lot of time, and we're depriving ourselves of our own inheritance and something that we is properly meant for us, and which God, means to enrich us through. So, that's, I would say that if you go the Irenaeus is wrong, route, and this is an error. What's kind of interesting, and I'll just throw this out there. I taught a Gospels class this past semester, and one of the things that I was looking at was, that trying to figure out, hey, how do you actually date, the death, the life, death of Christ? How do you make this all work? Because we all have the numbers 30 and 33 in our head, and which, we know sometime around 30 from Luke 3, because that's what, Luke goes and says that Jesus was around 30 when he goes and starts his ministry. With the 3-year cycle from the Gospel of John, you kind of put those together. But if you're actually looking in like specific dates that the Gospels are attesting to, the Gospels are pretty, that Herod is alive and around when Jesus is born, and that's the context in which everything around early life of Jesus goes and takes place. And you look at when scholars actually date the death of Herod, and it's a huge kind of scholarly question. When has happened? But the death of Herod sometimes goes as far back as 4 to even 6 BC. And so Jesus is alive then, and that's they're fleeing, because that's why he goes down to Egypt, is because Herod is around then. And you take that as real history, which you probably should take that as real history if you're appealing to these texts for saying why it is that Irenaeus must be wrong. Irenaeus can only be wrong if these texts are historically correct and Jesus was 30, was actually around 30. So either they're historical or they're not. If that's the case, and then you look at the different estimates for when the crucifixion would have taken place, you can actually get pretty close to 40 years old if you go and you put all the material together. Now, how close would you get exactly if you're sticking still to around 30 means probably not more than 33 to 34, who knows, something like that to start with, and you got a 3-year cycle, so maybe crucified 36, 37. I don't know if Irenaeus ends up being a helpful witness to try to sort out some of those kinds of things, and just saying like, hey, he was at least closer to 40 than he was to 30. But it's one of the things that's interesting is coming across New Testament scholars, and just who are looking strictly at this historically, and in relation to the dating of Herod, who end up saying things with no reference to Irenaeus, which sound kind of like what Irenaeus is saying, that he was a little bit older than you think, and that would then give you explanation for for why you get what's said in John 8, why the Jews are saying what they are. So anyway, I throw that out there as a thought piece, and not as and just as an observation that I've made in going trying to figure out the chronology of Jesus's life in the over the past year. It's, at least according to some readings of the historical record, it's not as crazy as you might think.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, I heard somewhere that like the date for the birth of Jesus changed to like 4 BC or something like that, and that was kind of funny. But like the
yeah,
calendar, the timeline had to be moved up a little bit, right? And so if Jesus dies in like 33 AD, and then you have those 4 years, then it's like, oh, it'll be 37. So maybe.
yeah. It's really interesting. Can you end up being not that far off if that's the way that you put the material together. But again, there's people who devote their whole lives to biblical chronology and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And I got too many kids for that.
Yeah.
So I just just read what they say and then try to figure out some of the possibilities best they can.
Yeah, well, going back into some of the things that Irenaeus said, I mean, one thing that you used him for in your book was to get Paul's teaching on justification. And so, what would you say is Irenaeus's teaching on Paul's works of the law, on justification, and especially like the stuff that we're interested in today, right? Which is like, does Paul believe, or excuse me, does Irenaeus teach or interpret Paul as saying that we can add, quote unquote, to our justification or increase in justification or stuff like that? I mean, that's the really juicy theological stuff that people want to know about. And so what does Irenaeus say, if anything? Oh, yeah. So sorry to everybody. I don't know why my connection is weird today. It's whatever. But anyway, I was asking Dr. Thomas what Irenaeus had to say about Paul's teaching on justification, especially the quote unquote juicy stuff about, can we increase in justification? What works of the law mean? Does that include even our morally good works done in Christ?
Yeah. Gosh, this stuff is fantastic. And if I can, for anybody who's listening, if I can just recommend for them to actually read Irenaeus's works themselves. If there's, I think the only reason that people like my book and that my book has gotten attention is that I'm just giving you what the church fathers say on these issues. There's actually none of my own ideas in the book, and which strikes me as entirely appropriate because I'm not interested in what I happen to think either. But I find what they have to say really extraordinary and really really helpful. And Irenaeus is at the top of the list when it comes to that. And so the areas in Irenaeus and against heresies that I think are the most valuable and the most relevant to this is in book 4, and then particularly if you start around chapter 10, then going on to about chapter 20 in book 4 of Against Heresies. You'll get a lot of his Pauline exegesis in this area, which is just extraordinary. I first came across this as just a first-year graduate student at Regent College in 2011. I stumbled across all this when I was writing a paper on works of the law, and I just found it to be such life-changing material in the way that he goes and he interprets everything. I'll say there's a number of things I could say here. As a big picture thing, one of the things that for me was striking in encountering Irenaeus is how Irenaeus understands the nature of justification as something that is transformative. That's something for me and for my background, I didn't naturally read the text that way. I read the text as justification as a forensic, just I guess you could say a strictly forensic, forgiveness of sins, and so it's just a question of how are your sins forgiven. And what was one of the things that's really striking in reading Irenaeus is how, from his standpoint, that's only a piece of the story as far as what justification is, and how God's justifying grace is something that goes and actually changes you and transforms you. And it's really interesting the way he would go back to Abraham and the righteous patriarchs and talking about how Abraham was righteous by faith. And so, well, why didn't he have the Mosaic law, for example? Why didn't he have all this other stuff? Well, we didn't need it because he was righteous by faith. And when he says righteous, this isn't just strictly that he had forensically received the forgiveness of sins, but that he truly was righteous by faith. And then thinking, okay, well, why is it that Christians don't observe the Mosaic law? And the answer is because by the power of the Holy Spirit and by the renewal that Christ has effected in humanity, that we too have been restored to this righteousness. And he quotes 1 Timothy 1:9, for the law was not laid down for the righteous. And in English, we can get this mixed up because we think righteous and just are two different things. Are you into righteousness? Are you into justice? And in Greek, those are the same word. And so when we say Abraham was righteous by faith, that's the same. It's just using an adjective to say the same thing as Abraham was justified by faith. And so some of the confusion that we can get into, and that in some of the debates that we have in English, is not recognizing how those two are the same thing. Looking specifically at salvation in Irenaeus and how works of the law goes and relates to this. Irenaeus, I think the first thing you should say is that Irenaeus is as clear as you could possibly be that the source of salvation is God. God is the one who affects salvation in us, and humanity lacks the ability, apart from God's initiative, to go and receive salvation on their own. So you see this all over the place in a number of different. This is just one that I find particularly poignant, but you'll find this in every book of Against Heresy, stuff like this. So, for it was not possible that the man who had once for all been conquered and who had been destroyed through disobedience could reform himself and obtain the prize of victory. And as it was also impossible that he could attain to salvation who had fallen under the power of sin, the Son effected both of these things, being the Word of God, descending from the Father, becoming incarnate, stooping low, even to death, and consummating the arranged plan of our salvation. When it comes to, how is it that humanity is saved? I mean, he's always bringing it back to God and to God's action in Christ, and that what God's action in Christ does is something that makes possible what would be impossible otherwise. And so, you'll sometimes, I've come across, I came across a review of my book, one source talking about the second century fathers as being semi-Pelagians, I think is what they were described as. One, that's historically not useful because Pelagius was centuries later, and two, it's just not accurate if you're actually looking at what we understand Pelagius to have been saying, and what these fathers are saying. It's nothing like what Pelagius goes and says, and so that's the starting point from which everything else goes and comes. The question then is, how does works of the law go and relate to this? How do our own works go and relate? If you're looking at the question of works of the law, which is of course the main one that my book looks at, looking at the interpretation of this, the Pauline dichotomies, so justified by faith apart from works of the law. Irenaeus focuses specifically on the Mosaic law that was given, to use Paul's language, 430 years after the promises are made to Abraham. And he's clear from his standpoint that this is what Paul is talking about in his debates. And so what I have here is I have a few passages that I can go and read on this particular topic for you, which go and give you, it's basically either summarizing or giving you quotations from Irenaeus, and saying what is it that Paul is talking about and why is he talking about these particular elements of the law. And so again, focusing on the giving of the law at Horeb. So if you're thinking in terms of the golden calf and everything that goes wrong in the desert. So in discussing the continuity between the old and new dispensations, Irenaeus makes a distinction between those works that were particular to the period of the Mosaic law, and those that are greater and necessary for salvation under both. As Irenaeus writes, the precepts of an absolutely perfect life are the same in each testament. And while God has promulgated particular laws adapted for each, the more prominent and greatest commandments, without which it is not possible to be saved, he has exhorted us to observe the same in both. These greater commandments, which Irenaeus elsewhere calls the natural precepts of the law, so naturalia legis, appear from his perspective to be part and parcel of justification by faith. As Irenaeus writes, it is seen from his own words that the Lord did not abrogate the natural precepts of the law, by which man is justified, which also those who were justified by faith and who pleased God did observe previous to the giving of the law, but that he extended and fulfilled them. So you think, that's really interesting. So he sees justification by faith. Like, what does it actually mean to be justified by faith? Well, it means to be righteous, by God, by faith. What do we actually mean by faith, though? And I think for Irenaeus, faith is something that is, we think of faith as, or we can, I think of faith wrongly as a kind of, intellectual assent or something like that. But it's clearly something bigger than that for Irenaeus. And he has a bit here in this is in book 4, chapter 6, where he defines what believing in God is. He says to believe in him is to do his will. And so what does Abraham do? How is Abraham found faithful before God? Because God speaks to him and he does what it is that that God asks. That's how he has faith. And so I'm going to continue on here. Irenaeus illustrates this point with examples from the Sermon on the Mount, in which Christ expands Moses' prohibitions of adultery and murder to lust and anger as well. Contrary to the followers of Marcion, who regard these differences as an opposition to, an overturning of the precepts of the past, Christ's words exhibit a fulfilling and an extension of these natural precepts. I can continue on. There's a couple more passages that I think are relevant in thinking of why it is, if the Mosaic law is given for this particular period, why it is that within the New Covenant, the Mosaic law is not observed. And so this is in my book, this section on why these works are not necessary for the Christian. I'll just read a couple of the passages that are here. So in Against Heresies, the reason that the works of the Mosaic law are not necessary for the Christian is straightforward. A new covenant, and hence a new legislation, has come with Christ, the incarnate word. So you can think of the passage from Hebrews as well, where when you have the change in priesthood, the change in legislation that goes along with it. It's really, really similar here. So as Irenaeus describes, the change in human nature wrought by the incarnate word renders unnecessary the bonds of slavery, the laws of bondage given to the people by Moses. And you can think here that the yoke of bondage that Paul goes and talks about in Galatians 5:1, where it says, do not submit again to this yoke of bondage. Irenaeus identifies this specifically as the Mosaic legislation given in the desert. Just as God gave a law suitable for the condition of the unruly people in the desert, and gave certain precepts in accordance with the hardness of their hearts, such as the multitude of ordinances and the permission of divorce, so too has God given a new law corresponding to the redeemed condition of humanity that has come with Christ's incarnation. While this old law, which was in operation from Moses until John the Baptist, was fit for slaves and those who are as yet undisciplined, the precepts of this new law are for those who are free and have been justified by faith. Again, you can see the tie between justification by faith and this full obedience to God. The abolition of the old laws of bondage is repeatedly and emphatically contrasted with the place of the Decalogues, the 10 Commandments, and the laws of liberty under the new dispensation. While works such as circumcision and Sabbath, which were given for bondage and for a sign, he canceled by the new covenant of liberty. By the new covenant of liberty. In the new covenant, Christ has increased and widened those laws, which are natural and noble and common to all. This is, I think, where this all goes back to is the idea that Christ in the new covenant transforms humanity. And so that what humanity is capable of now under Christ and in what he has established in the new covenant, it is the fulfillment of, what's spoken of in Jeremiah 31. It's the fulfillment of what Ezekiel, speaks of in Ezekiel 36. This, the circumcision of the heart, this renovation of humanity that the prophets go and talk about, and which elsewhere in the prophets you're going to see is promised for all of humanity. He just says, this is now taken place so that we can truly go and obey God in a way that is as he intended, in a way that goes and parallels, by analogy, what Abraham did when he was righteous by faith, and when he had, there's no Mosaic law, there's no any of these things around. And in that sense, you can see that Christians see themselves as truly Abraham's children, because they're doing the same thing that he did, and they're living the same kind of life that he did. So if you think of the promise to Abraham that his stars are going to be his children be as as the stars in heaven, the sands in the sea, or that he's going to be the father of many nations. Suddenly you have all these people from many nations who are all obeying and all have this faith like Abraham and are walking with God the way that Abraham was. And with that happening, it means that the Mosaic law, which was given for the hard-hearted condition of humanity, to go and to readopt that law, or to try to make necessary this law, and to say, hey, you have to go and continue to practice the Mosaic law, you have to continue to be part of the Jewish nation and covenant, you have to continue to do all of this. All of that is simply to deny that Christ has come. All that is simply to deny that this kind of renovation has happened. Because if the promised change of heart has now taken place, if God truly has taken out your heart of stone and given you a heart of flesh, then it would seem incongruous to go back to the old legislation, which was made for those who are hard-hearted, and say, oh no, you have to go and obey this now, and pretend as if a new covenant hadn't been instituted in Christ. So that's a kind of a taste of what Irenaeus has to say in this area. It's extraordinary stuff.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
That's beautiful. Well, Dr. Thomas, I got one last question for you,
Yeah.
and then we'll wrap it up. So here's kind of a big question that people want to know about. What did Irenaeus, excuse me, my Midwestern twang just came out. What did
Irenaeus?
Irenaeus and lions? No, what did Irenaeus mean by apostolic succession?
Yeah. So, Irenaeus, I don't think means anything different from what anybody else in the early church means by apostolic succession. And so there's a sense in which, we don't even necessarily need to care what Irenaeus says about apostolic succession, nor did Irenaeus care about what he meant by it, because I think everybody essentially, meant the same thing.
They're passing along the same thing. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, if that is, I think from the standpoint of 21st century, if that's a really interesting question, Irenaeus would be very perplexed by that, just because it's a really basic question from his standpoint. If you're looking at what you see in First Clement, for example, where Clement is talking about how the apostles knew that after their departure that the churches would easily go and fall into division, which is why they went and they committed people who they trusted to go and to be their successors in the various churches, to continue on the ministry that Christ had entrusted them with. And then the witness that you see to that in sources like Ignatius of Antioch, and the way that those who are the bishops in the churches, the authority that they have, and the way that they're regarded as being carrying on the really distinctly apostolic ministry, the distinctly apostolic charism, which I originally from a very, very low church background. So I remember when I first read that, just thinking like, what in the world is going on here? So too with Irenaeus, he doesn't have any sort of specific understanding of apostolic succession. He just attests to the reality of the apostolic succession, the same way that these other figures go and attest to it. And I think if you're thinking of the way that for instance the scriptures have been preserved faithfully in the churches and handed down and copied and preserved from generation to generation, so too the actual authority that was given to the apostles to do, I think, uniquely apostolic things. There's things that are spoken uniquely to the apostles in Scripture that are not given to every other believer in the same way. That charism of leadership is something that is carried on in a way that is analogous to the way that the Scriptures are preserved and passed down faithfully. So to that charism of the succession of those who were leaders in the various churches is passed on from person to person, from leader in the church to leader in the church. So that's one of the things that Irenaeus makes appeal to, that's distinctive about the universal Catholic Church of his own time. And when I say Catholic, it's hard because it's such a loaded term, and some people
universal, right?
Yeah, some people think it's so easy to go and think, well, you mean he wasn't Orthodox, or you mean he wasn't an Anglican, or you mean whatever happens to be. I'm not trying to engage any of that. And there's lots of great Orthodox and Anglican lovers of Saint Irenaeus as well. They should be. But yeah, that's one of the things that Irenaeus appeals to as being distinctive about the universal Christian church in comparison to the Gnostics. The Gnostics have their own secret kind of lineage, and so somebody says, Valentine says, well, I learned this from Theudas, who was secretly a disciple of Peter. But you wouldn't know that because you don't have the cool secret stuff. And Irenaeus just says, look, you can, if you want to know where our lineage comes from, you can literally go to any church anywhere in any city, and they will go and tell you the public record of those who were the leaders in the churches going back to the apostles. So they can tell you which apostle they got their lineage from, and then who has who that particular role of leadership has been committed to. And so, and that's the famous passage in at the beginning of book 3, where he goes and says, you can do this with any of the churches. It'd be tedious to try to do it with all the churches, but if you want to take the Church of Rome, this is, you take that one. And then he goes and he gives you, so, Peter, to Linus. And then this gets into, of course, my stuff with Clement. How does Clement go and relate to all of this? And it goes forward from there. So, as a I guess you could say, as a historical phenomenon, I think that the apostolic succession is about as uncontroversial an element as you're going to find, I think, historically considered. And when it comes to the reality of the churches transmitting the leadership and the offices, from one person to the next, from one generation to the next, and the appeal that all of the churches go and make to those who were first, either ordained, either the apostles or those who the apostles went and ordained to go and to be in the positions of leadership. That's something that's universal within early Christianity, and much more universal than some of the things that we even go and take for granted. And so some of the things that like the canon of Scripture, the canon of the New Testament, there is if you're looking in Irenaeus, there is a real canonical sense, I think, in Irenaeus. Some people will go and argue against that and say the Bible, the New Testament doesn't. And sometimes it's interesting. You get people who are more liberal and some people who are more conservative who both kind of say something like this, like, the Bible doesn't really come into being until the 4th century or whatever. Or Constantine made it up, or that's where the canon of Scripture comes from. It's better. And one of the things that's striking in Irenaeus is how early you already have what seems to be at least a canonical concept with respect to the New Testament, in that there really seems to be this consistent set of authoritative writings that he is appealing to. And there's some that are on the margins. So, he appeals to First Clement, and he appeals to the Shepherd of Hermas. And there's other ones that which don't, eventually make it into the canon of the New Testament. But there's still a reality that's there. That's a common appeal for, I think, for he and who are his readers. One of the things that's striking is that I think that actually the Apostolic Succession is even less controversial than something like, the New Testament canon, because whereas the New Testament canon is something that I think is agreed upon early on, but with variations that continue on for a long time, it's very difficult within Orthodox Christianity to identify something that is not, and I guess you could say, that's not an Episcopalian sort of structure to Christianity, not Episcopalian in the sense of, U.S. Anglican, whatever. I don't mean anything negative against U.S. Anglicans, but that isn't based, in the Apostolic Succession, and that doesn't see the way that, and doesn't understand the way that Christ and the apostles committed for Christianity to be transmitted, and for the way that ecclesiology is to work, to be under the system. That's one of the things that, again, being from a very low church background, I remember looking at this and just saying, like, where are all like the hidden Baptists? I know they're somewhere. I know we're around here somewhere. What about like our really low church charismatic folks who don't believe in any, like, where are the Quakers? I want to know where my Quaker friends are. And it's one of the things that's really striking is this is a piece that just seems like it's just common coinage in early Christianity and shared, it's if you think that back to that passage in 110, that shared apostolic heritage that everybody goes and participates in.
So there wasn't kind of a flat egalitarian structure. There was clearly a hierarchical sense. Bishop and presbyter were distinct offices.
Again, I think that even once you stop and think about it, this goes back to the New Testament itself. If you're thinking, in terms of, it's not as though Paul thinks that everybody is on his level. Hey guys, I've got some thoughts I wanted to share with you here. And if you think differently, that's okay. That's totally fine. Don't worry about it. But I just want to share this, kind of throw it out with you, see what you think, get some feedback on your ideas.
Got this thing on my heart,
I got this thing on my heart I want to share. And like, look, all of that is good stuff. All that has a place. The question is that the apostolic place? Is that the particular role that that Christ gave the apostles, and is that what they, in going and ordaining people to continue on that specific ministry, is that what they meant to go and have happen? And it's interesting. I remember thinking about this, sometimes thinking like, well, maybe it's all like a big conspiracy, right? Like maybe it's this huge conspiracy. I guess start to kind of do the fun Bart Ehrman thing where like, it's all, you can't trust these guys. Like, they don't know anything. Like they're just making stuff up. They're just they're like, whatever. You kind of they're just telling you what they want you to believe when they say the whole church is unified and everything like that. They know it wasn't. They're just pulling the the rug over you. Are you gonna believe those guys? But here's the thing that's really interesting. In the same period, we also have these sources clearly telling us the instances where there is disagreement. And so Irenaeus, again, is the obvious one for this, because Irenaeus, we know, and everybody knows, Irenaeus is the one who disagrees with Pope Victor when Pope Victor goes and wants to, when he wants to excommunicate the churches of the East over in the Quartodeciman controversy. You see preservative force, but everybody goes and knows this. So that you have the disagreement. Do you go and celebrate Easter on the 14th of Nisan? Do you celebrate according to the Jewish calendar, or do you celebrate it according to the Greco-Roman kind of calendar everybody else is following? And you've got Polycarp and those in the churches of the East who say, no, John followed the Jewish calendar. He taught us to do it this way. This is genuinely apostolic, and so we're going to keep doing it. And then you've got the rest of the churches which say, no, we shouldn't be following the Jewish calendar for this. It's not the right way to do it. We're going to do it over here instead. And so you've got, think of the church's biggest feast. There's something, if you're going to have a truly unified church, there's a problem in having this being held on different days. And so it's a matter of some importance. Polycarp comes to Rome. I think it's Anicetus he's talking to. They try to work it out and they can't work it out. This is one of the things that goes and stands out. Like, we can't figure out, because the apostles gave us, different practices for how to go and to do this. It seems as though both practices are apostolic.
Wow.
And if they're both apostolic, then I don't think that we can really force one person or the other to go into, to say, no, you have to go and do what we're doing instead of doing what you're doing. So there is this really kind of beautiful, we're going to agree to disagree on this one, because both of these ideas have a really good heritage. And you fast forward a couple decades, and Pope Victor doesn't find that to be satisfactory. And so, it all goes and heats up again, and he's going to go and, excommunicate those churches of the East that are going and following still the Jewish calendar and doing, following the quarter-decimal practice. And Irenaeus just rebukes him in a way that it's not disrespectful of his office. He recognizes his office. He doesn't question his authority to go and to do this, but he says, I don't think this is prudent. And I don't think this is prudent because I think that there is, even though we have what's clearly a difference of opinion here, both of these positions have an apostolic heritage. They both have people that we recognize as being saintly, representatives of the faith who held to these positions. And if that's the case, then we, as nice as it would be to be completely uniform on this question, it goes against wisdom and charity to go and to try to force uniformity in this area.
Mm-hmm.
And it's great is that Pope Victor listens to him. It's this beautiful. There's a for any Protestants who are listening and thinking to yourself like, gosh, I love this guy Irenaeus, but I feel uncomfortable. Like, the guy stands up to the Pope and he wins. How cool is that? There's a fun little, like, if you're thinking back to Galatians and kind of Paul standing up to Peter, there's a really interesting parallel that goes and happens here. And in the same way that we look at Paul and we think Paul seems like he was right in that it seems like Peter needed somebody to kind of bring him to his senses in this, because he was acting in a way that was inconsistent with his confession. Mm-hmm. So too, it seems like Irenaeus actually really helps Pope Victor and helps the church universally, and goes and Eusebius goes and tells us he's truly worthy of his name, Irenaeus, as as a peacemaker, as the man of peace, which is of course what Irenaeus means in Greek. It's a fantastic example where you can see that it's not as though there's never any kind of conflict here. It's just that when there is conflict, we can actually identify it historically and see what this was about, what the different parties we're holding to. On something like this, which is a big deal, there's no conspiracy to be like, oh no, like we're going to go and we're going to make it look like everybody always agreed all the time. The church was always one and believed everything. They're totally transparent about, this was a big issue and this is how it was resolved. And so I think that is, if one is holding to that paradigm, that sort of like kind of big kind of conspiracy theory sort of deal, where they only preserve the history that they wanted you to hear. You have to explain stuff like the quarter-decimal controversy, which is like, well, what about this one, which was clearly a big issue and a big deal and really embarrassing for a lot of people. Why are they telling the truth about this? And I think it's difficult.
But there was no dispute on the necessity of apostolic succession, right? Of having a bishop or, the presbyters trace their ordination back to the apostles.
Again, it's like, it's one of those things where it's hard to even talk about it as a point of debate, or like, hey, here's this necessary something, because it's just taken for granted everywhere.
I see. Yeah.
It's just taken for granted everywhere. So if you read, for instance, the beginning of Eusebius, at the beginning of his history, the very first thing that he tells you that he's doing is that he's going to tell you the succession of the apostles and all the various, great churches throughout the world, because is so basic and, so important. And what's interesting is that he can actually do this more easily than he can identify the canon of the New Testament, because he goes and he
Wow.
tells you when you read Eusebius' history, he gives you these different canonical lists in different places, and they don't agree with one another. And he clearly goes and says, yeah, there's some books that everybody agrees with, and there's other ones was like, Second Peter, boy,
Yep.
nobody knows, nobody knows there. And there's and even then the different canons he gives, they don't map perfectly with one another. And so there's a sense in which that tracing of the apostolic heritage is just is basic, is kind of
Yeah.
Christianity
Dr.
101.
Thomas, if I can ask you one last question.
Yeah.
Seriously, one last question.
Yeah. This is you're a dirty liar, Stellan.
Yeah, I know. Well, I was going to ask you too, like what you thought about. I know that you skimmed or you looked at my paper for a little bit, but I did talk about how I think a good analog, or even a parallel, and could be even the origination of the teaching on apostolic succession, was the fact that the Pharisees and the judges on the high court in Jerusalem and the lower tribunals, they would have to be able to trace their order when you were being ordained with the laying on of hands, semika. You'd have three gentlemen doing it, and one of the men ordaining you had to be able to trace his ordination through Joshua and to Moses. And my argument has been, and especially like my research into the Semitic origins of New Testament ecclesial structures, has been that it appears as if Irenaeus and the other, witnesses that we have here, they're not inventing something just to fight the Gnostics. Like they're actually seemingly passing on a first century practice wherein we see that the church seems to be modeled after the Jewish legal system. What did you think about that argument or that thesis?
Yeah, it's really interesting. As you're talking, I have this passage from Irenaeus come to mind, where Irenaeus is talking about the apostles, and he talks about the apostles as the priests of the new covenant, the priests of the new covenant. And it just strikes me as a really, really close analog for what you're saying there, and the necessity of going and being able to trace back where you come from. I've been going through Josephus's Antiquities this summer, and that's one of the things that you come across there. And then of course, just when you're reading the Old Testament itself, the necessity of being able to trace back your lineage, the necessity of being able to demonstrate where you come from, and how it is that being unable to demonstrate that makes it so that you're not able to serve. And even if you're thinking in like back to Ezra, Nehemiah, when you have all the the returnees from Babylon, and there's certain people who can't go and demonstrate their lineage, and so because of that, they can't go and take the risk. They can't go and integrate them, because that lineage is essential for them to be able to be a part of it. And it has to be something that has actual real solid attestation. I think that provides a really clear analog for what it is that you find within early Christianity. And I say analog, I think that even analog might be too distant of a term. One of the things that I'm working on right now is over the past month, I was asked to write the entry on Israel for the dictionary of Paul and his letters that IVP has coming out, which is great fun. It's a huge challenge, because you think of Romans 9:6, not all those who are Israel are Israel. You think, oh gosh, you're asking me to write the article on this? Thanks a lot. So it's a challenge, but it's been a huge blessing. And one of the things that just seems like it keeps coming out over and over is how it is that it seems that Paul really thinks that Christians are made part of Israel. That that within the new covenant, Christians have now been truly engrafted into Israel. If you think of the image that he goes and uses in Romans 11 of the olive tree and all that, you're truly grafted into this within what God has now done within the new covenant. And though there is a new covenant, it's the same God, it's the same heritage. It's just the promises that were made to Abraham and that were reaffirmed to the prophets through this lineage, this promised worldwide blessing through Abraham and his seed is now coming to pass. And so if you go to Ephesians 2, these Gentiles, they're all estranged from the citizenship of Israel, and or the Commonwealth of Israel, and they're without God and all that. And God has now reversed this in Christ, so that they're now partakers of the citizenship of Israel. And so, yes, is there? It's not so. Yeah, there's a new covenant. There's not. It's not as though these kinds of figures have to go and to Irenaeus and friends. It's not like they have to go and demonstrate their priestly lineage in an old covenant sense and saying, how do you go back to Aaron? How are you actually a Levite? Because there is something that Christ is really going and recreating Israel and a restorative function, not in doing something different, but he's restoring Israel and going and choosing the 12 apostles, and the way this goes and represents the 12 tribes. So there's a renewed Israel that's there in the new covenant, which is made of both Jew and Gentile, and has these Gentiles grafted in, and that within that the same way that I guess you could say, if you think of Isaiah 66, where Isaiah in the vision, he sees that you're going to see these Gentiles who are going to be coming in. They're going to be they're going to be coming into the nation, and that God is going to take some of them. He's going to make some of them priests and Levites. And you think of how the new covenant is the fulfillment of the vision of Isaiah and the end of Isaiah 66, and not everybody is taken to be a priest and a Levite in the same way, but some of them from among the Gentiles are taken to this. They are made, priests and Levites, and they are made to be those who hold this, this priestly role, for which the priests of the old covenant go and set the example. And so, yes, is there I think biblically, is there a priesthood? Is there an authority that every baptized believer goes and participates in? Absolutely. Which again, you just go back to the Old Testament for that as well. Exodus 18:19. Though the whole world is mine, you'll be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That the whole nation is priests. The whole nation is holy. But there's still a role for an ordained priesthood within that nation of priests. There's the priests themselves, the priestly people are themselves still given priests to go and to serve within them, as the Levites did, and to still be the authorities who are going to go and to help to manage the oracles of God, so to speak. And that's something that I think continues on, by extension, not just by analogy, but really by extension, and a worldwide extension within the new covenant. So it's really cool. I think what you put together there is really helpful, and it helps to show the continuity of what you find within the Jewish context and within the old covenant, and how God is active in the new covenant.
Well, Dr. Thomas, thank you so much for just this wonderful interview, man. We covered so much, and there's just so much good material, and yeah.
No, I really appreciate you having me. It's a blast. If we want to have like a viewing party for Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter,
oh yeah,
I think that'd be fantastic. We could do it over Zoom or something like that. And if your audience wants to go and do it, because I could stand to be educated here. I've been using this analogy for years. And it's possible that there's hidden insights that I haven't quite gotten to yet. So
yeah, maybe get that secret knowledge, right, Dr. Thomas?
Yeah, it's all about it. It's all about.
Well, thank you so much once again, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Great, thank you.